Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your host, Jude Bazerman, here on the No Pulp podcast with Alex Grondin and Braeden Cheverie. And guys, let's jump right into talking about the new college football playoff rankings. And one of the biggest debates that's surrounding these rankings right now is who should be ranked higher, Michigan or Clemson? Let's jump right into it.
Looking at it, I think Clemson deserved to be ranked higher, if I'm being honest. I mean, if you look at their schedule, they've had a tougher schedule, played more ranked teams. I mean, they were ACC teams, and they probably should have won by more. But, you know, for going off rankings alone, I think that they deserve to be higher. But I do think in a head-to-head, Michigan would win. I think they got a better offense. In fact, they have Blake Corum, a Heisman Trophy candidate, running back with over 1,000 rushing yards, 15 touchdowns, and 6.2 yards per carry. So, like I said, I think Michigan's a better team, but I think Clemson should be ranked higher.
I'm going to have to agree with Alex right here. The opposing schedule does play a factor. It plays a big factor in these rankings. And so Michigan only playing one ranked opponent, beating them, of course, being undefeated. But Clemson pretty much every week is facing a ranked opponent, and it's not always pretty. You know, there are certainly more close games
than one would like. Yeah, absolutely.
For the Tigers, but I got to go. Will Shipley has burst onto the scene. They got incredible quarterback, stifling defense, who can give up some big plays, but overall, no rushing yards against that D.
Yeah, and the big thing is here, like, if both these teams go into the final week of the regular season undefeated, that means Michigan's pitted against Ohio State. Really, if they lose that game, they're out of it. Would you say that that's a fair assessment? I mean,
I think it depends, because you make a good point with that. I mean, obviously, there's, you know, within the top five, some of these teams have to lose. Tennessee, Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan. I mean, those guys play each other, but Clemson doesn't really play anyone really that difficult the rest of the season. So they could end up undefeated. And I guess the question is, do you take an undefeated Clemson over a Georgia or Tennessee or Ohio State or Michigan that has one loss? And I think it's only fair based off rankings that you do take that team.
Yeah.
Do I think that they're gonna even do well in the playoffs? I don't think so. No, but if you're looking at rankings, you have to take Clemson in that circumstance. So that's what I think.
Braeden, what do you have to say about this?
I think Michigan can kind of be a dangerous team towards the end of the year because of emotions. We saw what happened against Michigan State.
Of that was rough. That was definitely
that's going to take a toll on the player's psyche. Also, more of a personal opinion, Harbaugh is more of an emotion-driven coach, and that can work to their benefit or be their downfall at the end of the season.
And Alex, this goes back into what you were saying, but strength of schedule. You're saying that Clemson always is playing like these kind of maybe 15 to 25 ranked teams, and Michigan has their Penn State ranked now, number 15, and then at the end of the year, Ohio State again, who's going to be probably ranked 1, 2, or 3. What would you rather have in a team in the college football playoff? A team that beats maybe 4 or 5 mid-ranked teams, or 1 or 2 top-ranked teams?
I think that if Michigan beats Ohio State, I think Michigan should be in there over Clemson, because if you look at it, personally, I mean, Clemson, they beat 3 mid-ranked ACC teams, but they beat Wake Forest by 6. It was like 54, something like that. And then they beat NC State by 10, and they beat Syracuse by 6 in a game where Syracuse probably should have won that game.
They put up 0 points in the second half, and they still only beat them by 6, And
they had so many penalty yards. They honestly, it's a possibility that they had more penalty yards than offensive yards in the second half. I mean, they were getting penalties everywhere. The late hit that, of course, extended that play, and then Shipley with the over 50-yard rushing touchdown.
Yeah.
So, don't get me wrong, it shows determination, but hosting that team, you should beat them. Mm-hmm. But I don't even know if Clemson's going to finish undefeated because, they go at Notre Dame this weekend.
Notre Dame's a sneaky team.
A team who just destroyed Syracuse at the Dome. They hosted Syracuse and won by 6 points in a late comeback. And quite frankly, maybe if the late hit on Schrader was called, then Syracuse could have had a better chance. But with all that being said, I mean, at the end of the day, they did get the win regardless.
A win's a win, no matter
but
how.
Yes, I think if Michigan beat a number 2 ranked Ohio State team, whether they're number 2, number 3, or number 4 at the time, because they played them last week, of course, I think that matters more.
If I may just jump on that point with penalties you mentioned, 2 very disciplined teams in terms of Michigan and Clemson, but Clemson is losing that battle, giving up 462 yards on penalties for the year, significantly lower for Michigan, looking at about 300 yards, so a 100-yard difference there. Those can certainly add up, especially in the playoffs, and taking, you know, the refs out of it and calls that should have been made, calls that shouldn't have been made, because that is the human aspect of the game. It comes down to the O-line, holding most common penalty, and those can certainly add up. So forget the targetings, forget the pass interference that are going to skew these numbers a little bit. Which O-line is more disciplined? I think you have a lot more versatile, agile O-line in Death Valley, and then Michigan, you just have a bunch of giant guys, and I definitely think they're less likely to hold and more likely to bulldoze someone.
and then one final storyline to pick on in the Michigan versus Clemson debate is the benching of DJ Uiagalelei against Syracuse a few weeks ago. I mean, that's something to worry about, isn't it? That's a beat-up Syracuse defense that he could simply not perform against. I mean, what if you're even Notre Dame? Like, do we trust DJ to perform against Notre Dame this week?
I think I would. He's been relatively consistent all year, and I know that I kind of went in on them for that game. But look, they still got the win either way, and I think honestly, regardless of the quarterback that was in at that time, it was just destined that they were going to win that game. No matter what happens, I think both those quarterbacks are fully capable of beating a Syracuse team. But I think that DJ is the guy to trust moving forward, and I would keep him in for sure.
I'd have to agree. Cade Klubnik, he came in and he turned that game around for
It was a complete
Clemson.
shift of momentum. You could just feel it in the stadium when he entered the game.
100%, and that's similar in baseball. You go to the bullpen, you put a new guy in, you motivate the guys, and I remember one shot when he was told he's coming in, him going to the huddle, the guys getting all hyped up.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, let's be a little realistic. He has a 47% completion. So with that, I think, like I mentioned earlier, Shipley, the running back, really was the difference, and the defense pitching a shutout in the second half then. So I think he kind of shifted the momentum, but I definitely think DJ is your QB1.
Absolutely. And guys, that's a debate that will definitely have college football fans circling around for weeks to come. But let's take a trip a little bit further down south to LSU. Are they deserving of their top 10 ranking, guys?
I personally believe so. Yes, they had their week 1 loss against Florida State, and as bad as that was, they just crushed Ole Miss. I mean, they beat them 45-20.
An Ole Miss team that was undefeated to that point.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that, regardless of the AP poll and where they have them ranked at 15, I think that 10 is fair for them, because I don't know many other teams in that CFP poll that can beat them. And also, you got to take into consideration, it is their first year with their new coach, Brian Kelly. So with all that being said, I think it's fair that they're there. Do I see him making a big difference, this year? Not really. They'll have their bowl game, they'll do fine, but moving forward is really when they're gonna have to put their foot on the gas and do all the future.
I think LSU, you got Joe Burrow, you got Jamar. Wait, that was a few years ago. Who is this new team? I mean, we all expected their downfall, and now they're in the top 10, deserving or not. It's impressive. It really is, after losing national championship worthy, for
really
much
their entire offense at that point. Yeah,
3-4 years in a row, your entire offense and some of your secondary is now in the league in their second, third year. It's been very impressive. This was a team that has always been a football school, but at the same time, we expected them to take that step back. I think very deserving.
Yeah, to be honest, their season has completely surprised me as well. They were really a blocked extra point away from taking that week 1 game against FSU into overtime. And the only team that's beaten them now, after that FSU game, is Tennessee. And they're the number 1 team in the country. They would steamroll almost any team they play outside of Alabama, Michigan, or really anyone in that top 4. It's going to be interesting to see, because LSU does play Alabama this week. How do you guys see that playing out?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably, other than obviously, Tennessee and Georgia, that's a must-win game for Alabama. Yeah. Alabama has to go to LSU, that they have to beat them. And if they don't, they're out of the college football. There's no way they're going to have any chance moving forward. But it'll be kind of a classic game between those two teams. Historically, they've always gone back and forth, so we'll see what happens. But that's a very important game. I would take Alabama in that game. Brian Kelly's first year versus Nick Saban, who's just a college football genius. So I would take Alabama in that game. But I think it's going to be closer than people expect it to be. Probably sometime within 10 points, something like that. But we'll see.
I think the scary number in college football, especially around this time of the season, is 3. And that 3 will be in the losses category for LSU if they're not able to beat Alabama. And I think once you reach that number, there is no talk of college playoffs anymore. There's still a great season, a great team, but I think this is the make or break week for them.
And it's very interesting because you could argue that scary number 3 could be reduced even to 2. How many 2-loss teams will be in the college football playoffs? What, 1, 0?
Potentially.
Like, does a 2-loss Alabama team even have a shot, guys?
I really don't think so. No, I mean, because if they go ahead and they lose to LSU, then that means that they have now lost to, I think, just those 2 ranked teams, which obviously Tennessee. I mean, at that time, Alabama was the favorite team to win that game.
Absolutely.
So, it's a little bit, it was different then. But I think if you lose against LSU, a team who people are questioning whether they should be the 10th in the college football playoffs and are 15 in the AP poll, I don't think you have a chance in making it. Because if you're looking at the rest of it, Tennessee, Georgia could get 1 loss against each other. Same with Ohio State and Michigan. And Clemson, I mean, presuming that they do well against Notre Dame, let's face it, they're going to go undefeated, presuming that they beat, Notre Dame.
And then that's a lock for the playoff.
And pretty much a lock for the playoffs. And what we'll get into later is, teams like TCU and Oregon, who are also some of those 1-0 loss teams. But I don't think that you make it with 2 losses. So
I think Alabama at 6, Coach Saban, the alarms are ringing for him. That's something you don't see Alabama.
It's not right. I mean, any other team, 6 is a pretty good spot to be, but if you're Alabama, you're expecting to be 1 or number 2.
Exactly. So even a conversation in which they aren't in the top 4 is absolutely insane. And in the beginning of the year, you just don't think that, especially with Bryce Young at the helm. Alabama, again, like I mentioned on the flip side when we were talking about LSU, this is a big game for both sides. I do think a lot of the college football ranking and the college football playoffs is based on team status, record, ranking of opponent. And I think the status of Alabama, I think a 2-loss Georgia would make the playoffs before a 2-loss Alabama just because of the name. And, we can talk about why that is and stuff like that, but I think Alabama, in order to kind of quiet the haters, they need a win this week and basically eliminate a team.
Talking about that 2-loss point, I was just looking, since 2014, there has been no 2-loss team in the top 4. There was Penn State who had 2 back in, I think, 2015, and they were 5th. There was an Ohio State team that was 5th with 2 losses, but pretty much it's got to be 1 loss or less if you want to make it. And sometimes it honestly always goes down to the wire.
Yeah.
There's that 1 loss at the end of the season that could make or break your season.
It could screw you, yeah.
So I guess we'll have to see what happens. But
and I would just like to say, in regards to Brian Kelly, we might be a little biased here. Brian Kelly went to our high school. So I am rooting for him. I'm hoping he takes down Saban.
I don't blame you, yeah.
So, I think especially with the first-year head coach, you are the underdog, and you got to embrace that for LSU.
Yeah, I think people are really underestimating just how important this LSU-Alabama game is this weekend. I honestly think it's a must-win game for both of these teams, but let's go to a surprise non-Power 5 team. Tulane is ranked number 19. I mean, did you guys even see this coming, and do you find this ranking outrageous? Because some are saying it is.
I think there are certainly teams that could be ranked above Tulane, and we can get into those teams in a little bit, but I really, at 7-1, they've been impressive, and we've talked about two lost teams in front of them. And again, that has to do with strength of schedule, but Tulane has come in this season and shown that they aren't really a joke. And I feel like there's a similar narrative with Syracuse in terms of everybody's kind of waiting for
that 1 loss to happen.
Yeah. For them to finally be figured out. Finally, that underdog just runs out of tricks, and we see who they really are. Tulane hasn't shown that, at least as much as Syracuse has.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at it, I think they honestly deserve to be there and maybe even a little bit higher. I mean, Tulane played Kansas State at Kansas State, beat them 17-10.
Yeah.
So that is very impressive.
It's a huge win for a program like Tulane.
Oh, for sure, 100%. And so them being ranked there, being behind a team like Oklahoma State, behind a team like Penn State, Utah, Kansas State, who they beat. I mean, again, it comes down to strength of schedule. Only ranked team that they've placed. But I would see an interesting game being Tulane and Penn State. I mean, Penn State's lost to 2 ranked teams and has done what they had to do against, the unranked teams. But Tulane beat Kansas State, who at the time was ranked and now is ranked.
They're still a very good team.
Yeah, they're still a very good team. So I think it's definitely well-deserved. But I think they're around that area of 19, between the 15 and 19, I think is fair for them.
I agree. And going back to that Penn State point, I mean, they got blown out versus the 2 ranked teams that they played, or they lost. And Tulane, going back to your point, Braeden, it's kind of like a prove-me-wrong team. Yeah. Until that loss happens, they absolutely deserve to be in this top 20. I mean, why not? 7-1 is nothing to scoff at in college football, whether or not you're a Power 5 team. But, we'll go into some of the teams that we should maybe see ranked in front of them. I personally could see Wake Forest being in front of them. I mean, one of their 2 losses is against Clemson in overtime, a Clemson team that we just said is very good and maybe a slightly bit disrespected being under Michigan. What are some teams that you guys could see ranked above Tulane, if there are any?
If I'm being, obviously Illinois is ranked ahead of them, but I would say, I guess I would just say above Tulane. Yeah, I guess I'd say Wake Forest because I think that they're probably the best team between 20 and 25. And they put up a very impressive performance against Clemson, as you mentioned. And they play at NC State this weekend. So I think if they get that win, regardless of what Tulane does, I would put Wake Forest ahead of them. But other than that, I don't really see other teams who should be ahead of them right now.
I do like the Wake Forest take. Somewhere not on this top 25 is Notre Dame. And I'm not saying they need to be over Tulane at all, but it is kind of shocking to not see them on there at all. And of course, there's some bias. I'm still replaying that game in my head and crying about it. But like I mentioned earlier, the status of the team, and just because it's not a typical Notre Dame year, that doesn't mean they're not still a very good football team. Again, I think it's easier to get put into the discussion of top 25 when the results are there rather than, but it's Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And I really feel that any 15 through 25, any of those teams, next loss, those could be a new 15 through 25. So I as of right now, Tulane's safe. Next week, we might be having a different discussion.
Yeah, I agree. The 15 through 25 rankings of this week's CFP are incredibly volatile. I mean, just the Stanford loss really hurts Notre Dame, especially because that was at home. They really are the most inconsistent team in the country, and I think we're going to touch on that later, but let's stay in the Midwest. Go to Illinois, another 7-1 team, but they're in the Power 5, yet they're ranked below some teams, like a Penn State that we just touched on. What do you guys think about that?
I think it's disrespectful. I mean, honestly, Penn State did play 2 really good teams, and they, Ohio State and Michigan, but the Michigan game wasn't even close. It was like 44-17, something like that. And against Ohio State, you're at home and you got probably, I think, the biggest stadium in college football, and you have your home fans with you, and you keep it close for a little while, and then you blow it towards the end. And I think Illinois is a very, very good team, and I think that they should be ranked ahead of Penn State. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they're going to be challenging for college football playoffs necessarily. But ranked higher, yes, I believe so.
I completely agree. I think it would be outrageous to see that I pop up in the bracket of 4. But this is a very versatile team. The running back and quarterback sharing reps on the ground and in the air. About 1,600 passing yards, 1,200 rushing yards. That's something you don't see a lot at the college level. Each team has their set thing. You're either a passing team, you're a running team, you're a running quarterback team. This truly resembles an NFL team in breaking up the reps between running back and quarterback. When it doesn't work, they find a way to switch it up. That comes down to great coaching, great depth, but again, this isn't a top 5 or 4 team.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'd say is I think, we can have our opinions now for it, of course, but I think that question will not be answered until November 19th when they go to Michigan to play them.
That's a game I had circled on my schedule, too.
I'm not saying that they're going to beat Michigan, but if they could put up more than 17 points and they could have a better performance than Penn State did against them, then I think it's completely deserved that they should be ahead of them. Right now, I would still say that they should be ahead of Penn State. I mean, you're talking about a 7-1 versus a 6-2 team, and a team who people talk about how important it is to beat ranked teams. And I know that Illinois hasn't really had that opportunity because I haven't had them on their schedule, but I mean, Penn State lost to the only 2 ranked teams that they played. So,
what on the flip side of that, what do you think this Illinois-Michigan game does for Michigan? Is a respectable win for them going to take them out of the top 4?
I don't see a respectable. I would say all they really got to do is just win that game.
Okay.
You win that game, and you don't have to, but it's important. It's important that you try to make a statement, win that game, because the next week you're playing Ohio State.
Yeah.
So that is going to be the biggest game of the year for them. And that last 2 weeks is going to be hectic for Wolverine fans.
Most wonderful time of the year in college football.
Yeah. No, it's. I don't know if it's planned that way, but they always just put the 2 big dogs at the end there together. So we'll see what happens. Illinois, Michigan should be a good game, but no, I think it's a bit disrespectful that Illinois isn't ranked higher. There's a couple 2-loss teams in there with Kansas State. Again, a team we mentioned who lost to Tulane. So I would put them higher. I wouldn't say necessarily top 10. I'd say probably more like 11 through 14 area. But yeah, no, I think they're definitely a really good team.
Yeah, and coming up on the schedule for Illinois is, like you said, Michigan a few weeks away. But before that, Michigan State and Purdue, 2 teams that always play their Big Ten competitions very well. So we'll see how that shakes out. And let's move to TCU or Oregon. Which team has a better shot at sneaking into this playoff, guys?
I have some strong opinions here.
Let's hear it.
I do love Oregon, and I do think they've been underrated. But TCU, it's on a platter for them. They did what they had to do early in the year and towards the middle of the year. Their remaining schedule, nobody of importance. Now, of course, there are some sleeper games in there. I'm looking at the Texas game. That's a game they still have to win, and that could sneak up on them. But if they win out like they're expected to, they could be a serious conversation in there. This is another team that nobody really expected to be this high.
Yeah.
So, and they put in the work early. All their games have been close. I understand that, but it's fourth quarter is all that matters, and they've won.
I've just been waiting for you to finish because I'm going to have to disagree with you on that.
Oh boy!
I think that if you want to talk about both these teams winning out, then if both these teams win out, then Oregon should be ahead of them because they play Utah and they play Oregon State.
Inconsistency.
Two ranked teams. Utah is number 14, and Oregon State, I believe, is number 23. And by the time that TCU play Texas 2 weeks from now, they might not even be a ranked team. They're 5-3. They shouldn't be in there. I don't know why they are. But if Texas loses this upcoming week, they're not going to be a ranked team. They won't be.
Exactly. And they have an easy schedule.
But that's
TCU.
the thing. But you talk about what's important about beating ranked teams.
Yeah.
So if Oregon finish off their season and beat Utah and they beat Oregon State, 2 teams that they are ranked ahead of, then I see no reason why they shouldn't be ahead of them. I understand the whole 8-0 or 7-1 thing. I get that schedule, but I guess that really goes back to the debate of do you take a 1-loss team over an undefeated team if that 1-loss team's beating better teams?
And it's very interesting because that one loss that Oregon suffered, I mean, it was absolutely embarrassing. There's no way to get around that. A loss that big, I mean, you can't shrug that off. But ever since then, they've been rolling, and Bo Nix and their offense seems to have found their place. And let's just talk about it. Both these teams, every week in college football, you have the possibility of losing. It's really the question of, at this point, who has the greater possibility of losing? And personally, I would say that's TCU. I know the fourth quarter is all that matters, but when a lot of your wins are huge comebacks, how much longer, how sustainable is that? I just don't know at TCU. That Texas game scares me.
Well, what's not sustainable is Oregon fans. They're holding their breath every time Bo Nix touches the ball because of what happened in the first half of the year. Now, have they been unstoppable in the second half? No, because there have been some back and forth games, but they have looked like a much better team. This is a completely different team than the first couple weeks.
Yeah.
Like you said, a very embarrassing loss. TCU, not perfect either. Lots of comebacks. But the thing is, TCU seems to have the advantage right now, and Oregon looks to be fighting back.
I guess I would say I agree with you in the sense that TCU has the easier path to making the college football playoffs, but I think that if both teams go undefeated the rest of the year, then it should be Oregon ahead of them. But it's also going to be difficult for Oregon to win those 2 games. Again, they're 2 good ranked teams, and it's going to be difficult for them. And it's going to put them up against the wall. We'll see what happens. But I think if we want to talk about who deserves it more, I honestly see both teams deserving it a lot. I think both teams are really good. Both teams have had their struggles in the year. And again, I mean, if it wasn't a 49-3 loss, then maybe we'd be talking about how that's a bit more respectable. But I mean, yes, it was at Georgia, but I mean, that's a really bad loss to suffer. But again, you expect to lose against Georgia. They're a powerhouse in this league, so it's fair enough.
It's going to be very interesting to see these coming weeks. I would love to see TCU in the playoffs. I just really don't know how likely that will be. And let's segue into some undeserved ranked teams, because we've alluded to some that maybe shouldn't be on the list that are. So, Alex, we'll start with you. What are some teams that you see in the top 25 that really shouldn't be there?
Well, I mentioned the Texas Longhorns, but I'm also going to have to mention our Syracuse University.
Oh, okay. Don't have to do us like that.
Sorry, I have to do it. I have to. You lose to an unranked Notre Dame team, and I mean, yeah, you put up a good fight against Clemson, but you beat NC State without their starting quarterback. And other than that, you beat some teams who, yeah, they're good teams, but like you played UVA, who are like 3-5.
And they barely game-winning field goal got them through that.
Game-winning field goal. You beat Purdue because of luck. I'm sorry, I have to. It was a good play, I will say that. But again, it wasn't like any of us were expecting to see that happen. I guarantee you, all of us were like, "Oh, we lost this game." And we all stands were like, "Nah, it's over." But I think that they don't deserve to be ranked. I'm sorry, but definitely not Texas. I don't know why they're in there with 3 losses. We talk about not making the top 4 with 2 losses. I don't know many 3-loss teams who have stayed in that unless they've beaten really, really good teams. And I mean, if I pull up their schedule, they really haven't.
They crushed Oklahoma, but really Oklahoma is not. There's not a normal Oklahoma team that we usually see this year.
Right, and so I don't know how they're there, if I'm being honest, but that's what I'd say. And I'm sorry I have to go against our own team, but as much as I love Syracuse, I'm sorry I cannot see them being in the CFP rankings. AP, maybe. CFP, no.
So I'm going to agree with horns down. I don't think Texas belongs up here, and I think that has to do with the name and the culture of the school. I'm going to take a little bit opposite point of view from you. NC State, for me, looks like on their way out. The defense is big. It's an injured team, like you mentioned, I understand. And overall, they've been pretty good all year. But when we're talking about the actual playoff final, now in my heart of hearts, do I see Dino Babers hoisting the college football playoff championship? No. But do I want that number next to our S? Yes. But so NC State, I think, is in the same boat as that of, I think they're good enough to be in the ranking, but we could very quickly be on our way out with another loss. Doesn't matter to who.
No, and I understand that. Again, it's a banged-up NC State team who, I honestly think both teams are going to be on their way out. Between NC State, Texas, and Syracuse, both of them will be on their way out. I mean, we go at Pittsburgh, then you host Florida State, but I don't even know if we'll get another win until you play at BC in the final week. But these next 2 games against Pittsburgh and Florida State will be interesting to see, but I cannot see us doing anything against Wake Forest at Wake Forest. I mean, they put up like 45 against Clemson.
They gave Clemson a big run for their money.
And we could have if we decided to play football in the second half.
Score a point in the second half.
But I think Wake Forest, talking about how they're an underrated team and maybe they should be ahead of some other teams like Tulane, but looking at both their schedules, I don't really see either of those teams or even Texas, NC State, Texas, or Syracuse staying in the CFP rankings. And you mentioned that honestly 15 through 25 can change as the weeks go on, and we'll see how what it turns out to be.
We're going to see some teams squeak into that we haven't really even looked at. And guys, I'm in consensus with you. NC State has looked horrible, flat out horrible without Devin Leary. Got really beat up by Syracuse in the Dome, and again a Syracuse team that we're not even sure should be ranked. And then beat Virginia Tech by 1 point, and Virginia Tech is just awful this year. Yeah. So when you're starting quarterback, and Devin Leary's great, we know that, but when he's out for the season, there's no NC State, I would argue, is not a top 40 or 50 team. They should be nowhere near this top 25.
I think, especially when we look at injuries, you can't rank a team based on the healthy roster. You got to rank a team based on the guys that are going out and playing. And so, although I'm not as extreme in saying they shouldn't be anywhere near the top 25, because I really think their defense has some just huge bodies and some very, very talented players, and that's what gave Syracuse the hardest time. But again, I always like to say defense wins championships, but you need some offense, and that's something they don't have right now.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go back on that narrative of ranking a healthy team. You could have made the argument maybe if Quinn Ewers was still out, that Texas could be top 25, because all we heard when he got knocked out of Alabama and they only lost by 1 point, which was very impressive in and of its own right. But Quinn Ewers will be back. Texas will be so great, and then when he gets back, barely beat Iowa State, lose to Texas Tech. There's really no hypothetical anymore for why Texas should be in the top 25. So I'm in agreement with you guys. Why is Texas in here? And another team that we really haven't talked about is UCF. I know they're 25. Really doesn't matter too much in relation to the rest of the rankings, but a big, ugly road loss against ECU. I would take a team like Maryland or Baylor over them. What do you guys say?
I do like Baylor. I do. UCF is a team where, when you're at that 25 spot, it's kind of subjective on whether you should be there. It
really is.
And it could be Baylor in the 25, and we could be talking about UCF. So I didn't really want to mention them, considering you are the last ranked team.
It's kind of low-hanging fruit there.
Yeah, there's not a ton of storylines about that. Certainly another loss, they'll be out of the conversation completely. If a team keeps winning like a Baylor, they'll come into that conversation. But UCF, I don't really think they're in the CFP at all.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Alex, what do you have to say?
I mean, relatively speaking, yeah. I mean, those teams towards the bottom, I mean, like I mentioned, I talk about Syracuse, you talk about NC State, Texas, UCF. I mean, I guess it can fluctuate by the week, and I guess it depends on, their most recent performance. And I guess, the reason that Syracuse is still in there is because, they were in the rankings for a few weeks, and they've kind of just been, kind of going downhill since then. And Texas might be a matter of, winning their last few games and kind of being in that ranking still. So, no, I understand it, but there are definitely some other teams who I think should be, ahead of them, like a Liberty, actually, who are a 7-1 team who lost by 3 points to Wake Forest.
And surprising that they're not in the top 25, considering where Tulane stands.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, they're a 7-1 team, and I mentioned the one ranked team they played was Wake Forest, and they lost by 1 point, 37-36.
Wow.
So, and that was at Wake Forest too. So they're a team who I think should be ranked. And I mean, if you're 7-1 and you're behind pretty much a bunch of 6-2 and a 5-3 Texas team, I don't
just disrespectful
that.
at that
that's
point,
what I
would
believe
say.
too. Yeah.
I think upcoming this week, a lot of things are going to change, and this is the first playoff ranking that has come out for this year. A lot of things are going to change. We're expanding to 12 teams next year. How much will that change? So if we look at the current format right now, a UCLA would be making the playoffs next year.
Yeah.
And I do agree with that to some extent. But right now, all that matters is really the top 6, top 7 in terms of who's getting those games in the end. And again, can Alabama hold on? Can Tennessee continue to just dominate?
It's been impressive to see what they're doing.
It's been incredible, but over the next 2 weeks, more than anything, we're really going to see who's in the conversation.
Yeah, so going off that point, what are some teams that, and at the end of the day, the top 6 is really all that matters, at least for this year, but seeing that number next to your team's logo has to be a bit of a status symbol. So what are some unranked teams right now that we see maybe above some of the teams we just discussed?
Well, like I mentioned, I think Liberty should be up there. I mean, like I said, 1 point loss, that's totally fine, and then you win your other games, and it's not like they were close. I mean, there was one against Gardner-Webb. They won by 1 point, but they beat BYU by pretty much like 30 points. And they're beating teams relatively comfortably. So I see it being ranked, but they are going away to Arkansas tomorrow. So that should be an interesting game. And then against UConn, I mean, UConn's pretty much just a take my free win and leave kind of thing.
Little napkin in the wind kind of game.
Yeah, and then I could see winning the rest of their games. And then if you end with one loss, I mean, you should be up there.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand strength of schedule matters a lot. So, yeah, they might not be even in the top 10. But with the one loss, I mean, that can't be that bad. So I don't know why they're not ranked right now. But I think going forward, they will be. But it is the first ranking, so there are some things that are due to miss here and there, and I think they did miss on that one. Like I said, the whole Texas thing is just crazy to me. But other than that, that's pretty much all I have for teams who should be in there.
I don't necessarily think that, hear me out, everybody's going to get upset. FSU. I don't think they should be in the top 25, and that is the ACC bias, and we've seen a lot of them on campus. We've been talking a lot about them. But they're doing some really interesting things towards the latter half of this season. Like I mentioned earlier, Notre Dame could be in there. We were just talking about Baylor. They've done some really impressive things for their roster. It all comes down to our previous topic, which is who are we okay with taking out? And sure, we have some toss-ups, but they're really, other than Texas, in my opinion, there aren't any teams where there are more reasons they shouldn't be in than should be in. And so, of course, it's the first poll. Our entire job today is to talk about why it's wrong, but I think they were relatively okay compared to some of the prior rankings we've seen in other years.
Well, if you want to talk about Florida State, I mean, they beat LSU.
Statistically, they're a very good team, especially in the second half.
If you look at the other ACC teams that they've lost to, they lost to the other ones except for Syracuse so far because they haven't played them yet. But they lost to Wake Forest by 10. They lost to NC State, who had their starting quarterback at the time, by 2 points. Lost to Clemson by like 6 points. And then just dominated Georgia Tech. So they'll play Miami. And then I think if they go out and beat Syracuse, I don't know if they will or won't. If they come to the Dome and they beat Syracuse, there is no reason that they shouldn't be above some of the other ACC teams, or maybe even above Texas at the very least. But obviously, that's 2 weeks down the line, and Texas might be gone by then, and they might be replaced by a team who's more deserving.
Yeah, so much is going to change that we can't even predict.
Yeah, of course not.
I do like FSU with a number next to the letters at the end of the year. Nowhere in the football playoff conversation should FSU come up, but just in terms of where they deserve to end the season, I think the second half of the season has been incredible for them. Yeah,
and then Alex, going back to your point, I think one loss non-Power 5 teams, just non-Power 5 teams in general, get pretty disrespected by the CFP committee, and Coastal Carolina is another one that caught my eye. They have one loss to Old Dominion. Again, shouldn't really lose to Old Dominion if you want to be in the top 25, but teams screw up. Everyone has a bad day. Everyone has a bad week. And at the end of the day, they're 7-1. I think that deserves a top 25 spot. Yeah. Some other teams that caught my eye: Maryland, a Big Ten team with only 2 losses. Penn State's another Big Ten team with 2 losses. They're not just top 25. They're number 15.
Yeah,
it's very interesting. And then all these SEC teams with 3 losses: South Carolina, Kentucky, Mississippi State, Arkansas. The SEC is the hotbed for competition in college football. They all beat up on each other. I would definitely take some of those teams over teams ranked in the 15 through 25.
Yeah, no, for sure. I 100% agree with that. I think it's just a matter of sometimes they focus more on, wins and losses, and sometimes they focus more on, who you have beaten.
It really is a week-to-week kind of thing with the committee.
It kind of just depends. But yeah, no, I just said, with those teams beating up on each other, it's like, you beat a ranked team, next week you lose to a ranked team, and it just kind of goes back and forth, and just it's kind of like you're just staying at 500, even if you have more wins, but against your own own conference, you're kind of just staying in that 500 realm. And if one of those teams wants to emerge into the CFP rankings in the future, talking about next year, because I think it's pretty late at this point to make it there.
Yeah.
You got to be the top dog in your division. You have to do that if you want any chance of making it, because nowadays with one loss. And not even, don't even want to talk about 2 losses. It's almost impossible to make it into that.
I would argue impossible unless you're Alabama, Georgia, one of those very prestigious teams.
And I mentioned even Penn State and Ohio State, who have been teams who have been in this league for a long time now, still didn't get in with 2 losses.
Yeah.
And they were fifth. They were right behind everyone else. And they might have even beaten some of those teams that year. But because they had 2 losses, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
The middle of this football season has been insane. We saw Syracuse go undefeated for 6 weeks. Kansas in the very beginning. These are teams that are very, very low on the rankings right now, and just reflecting on the entire season, it's been an incredible season.
Yeah.
We're seeing Alabama not number 1. Like, this is crazy, and I think it's only going to get better and better. A big part of the rankings is adding, more excitement around these games, and we have a Tennessee-Georgia game coming up. I care very little about either of those teams, but I will watch every snap of that game just because it's who's taking the number 1.
It's on during the Syracuse game, though.
Oh, I got a phone. I can multitask.
Different screens. But yeah, no, there are a lot of good games this weekend for sure.
Yeah, and those big games are going to bring about big changes in the CFP. Guys, when this ranking comes out next week, what are some games that you could see causing some big tidal waves in the rankings?
Well, I don't know if I mentioned this to you off air, on air, but we talk about Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, LSU. It's a must-win for Alabama against LSU. Mm-hmm. They win that game, they have a chance of making the college football playoffs, and they will be rooting for Tennessee more than they ever have in their whole entire life, because if Tennessee lose, they will still be ahead of Alabama because they have the head-to-head win against them. And so that's very important. If Georgia lose, all they have for two ranked game is losing to Tennessee and beating Oregon in the first week. Yeah. And that's what they're holding on to so dearly. And you could talk about how Ohio State, they've only beaten 1 or 2 ranked teams as well. But I think it's different for Ohio State because they just recently beat a ranked team as well. So, it's not a must-win for Tennessee or Georgia. I think both those teams probably will end up making it. But if you're on the outside looking in, like a TCU, like an Oregon, one of these teams has got to lose between Tennessee and Georgia. Mm-hmm. And you're probably also rooting for LSU to win as well. And like we said last week of the season, Ohio State and Michigan. Like I said, we kind of talked about it earlier, but, there's also the Wake Forest-NC State game, which, will bring about some changes. But also, talked about it a little bit, but Clemson needs to win at Notre Dame this week. They need to. If they don't, I think that they are out.
Because they have to be,
Because then you've lost to a non-ranked team. You're 8-0, and then you go lose to an unranked team. But also, you talked about how it's kind of a surprise that they're not ranked. Yeah. I mean, they're inconsistent, so it makes sense in that case. But they just went to the Dome and destroyed Syracuse.
Yeah.
And Clemson at home barely won against them. And I know I mentioned that earlier, but that's going to be a really important game. But again, do I see them still winning by at least 10 points? Yes, of course I do. But Tennessee, Georgia, I'm still going to lean more towards Tennessee.
How can your eyes not be on that game?
Yeah, no, I'm still leaning more towards Tennessee, but Georgia is at home, so they're going to have their Bulldog fans with them.
Yeah, big advantage in that.
I think Texas and Kansas State is a game to keep an eye on, not to shatter any predictions or rankings, but it's going to say whether Texas belongs there or not. So if there's no upset, we knock Texas out of the top 25. We see where Kansas State ends up if they get into that top 10. Alabama, LSU, we talked about that earlier. And like you just mentioned, Clemson, Notre Dame. Is that going to put Notre Dame in the top 25? How far will that knock Clemson back if those results stand? Right. And then more of an ACC for laughs is Wake Forest, NC State. That's really going to shake things up in the ACC. Both bottom of the rankings for football playoffs. But I mean, I haven't mentioned it because everybody's going to be watching Tennessee and Georgia.
Yeah. No, I mean that is definitely might even be the game of the year. And
it very well could be.
Honestly, and depending on what happens, I think it'll be the game of the year is Michigan-Ohio State because it's last game of the season and it's probably going to decide a lot of things and it's going to shake up a lot of things. But yeah, I think if Clemson somehow loses this weekend, we could see TCU, Oregon, Alabama, and obviously Michigan all going ahead of them. And then you drop down to Southern California, who is also a
team we haven't even talked about today.
Yeah.
I don't think they're for real. I don't think they're for real.
And Ole Miss, who's 8-1, but they did, of course, just get crushed.
That loss to LSU is going to really hurt them and their chances.
But look, that'll be a very important game for Clemson and Tennessee, Georgia. I'll be just watching that game. I'll probably have Syracuse on in the background because I'm not going to lie, there's just one. It's pretty clear what's more the important game.
Some are saying it's the game of the century right now.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a bit of an overstatement, but it just shows how important. This is something we haven't seen out of Tennessee before, at least in my lifetime.
Oh yeah.
I'm excited, man.
It's incredible, and again, I keep saying it because I'm still in shock. Alabama is not in the top 2. Like, this could bring in a new era of college football. I'm not saying Tennessee is going to be a dynasty. We know Ohio State, Georgia, Clemson kind of are, and they're currently in that.
Yeah.
But Tennessee can really kind of clinch their spot in the playoffs.
No, it'll definitely be a very interesting weekend for college football and definitely the CFP rankings. And it'll be a big change next week depending on who wins those, the Alabama-LSU game and the Tennessee-Georgia game. And then, like we mentioned, bottom of the CFP rankings. We'll see what happens there.
Yeah, and I mean, there, as we all have said, there's going to be huge changes next week. So make sure to tune into the No Pulp podcast next week. For Braeden, Alex, and myself, thank you guys so much for listening, and have a great rest of your day.